Story 1. The Midnight Passenger. Marcus had driven taxis for 20 years. Late-night shifts through the back streets of New Orleans were his specialty. He knew the city like the back of his hand. The French Quarter's ancient buildings, the quiet, misty alleys, and even the cemeteries where the dead rested beneath crypts. Nothing spooked him anymore, or so he thought. It was an unusually quiet night, the kind that wrapped around you, making the shadows seem thicker than they were. Marcus cruised through the Garden District, the soft jazz from his radio offering the only comfort against the oppressive quiet. At 2:03 a.m., his radio crackled. "Pick up on Canal and St. Charles," the dispatcher called. "Destination, Metairie Cemetery." Marcus frowned. The thought of picking up a passenger this late for a trip to a cemetery didn't sit right. Still, a job was a job. Arriving at the intersection, Marcus saw her. A young woman stood at the corner, pale as the moon, in a flowing white dress that seemed too thin for the cold night air. She didn't move as the taxi pulled up, only turning her face toward him, a face with hollow, shadowed eyes. "Good evening," Marcus greeted her, trying to hide his unease. The woman silently climbed into the back seat. Her presence chilled the air. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her sitting perfectly still, staring out the window as if lost in thought. "Where to?" he asked, although he already knew. "Metairie Cemetery," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. As Marcus drove, the air in the car grew heavier. He tried making small talk, but the woman offered nothing in return. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to cling to the car. He felt an unnatural weight press down on him, as if invisible hands were gripping his shoulders. His knuckles whitened as he clutched the steering wheel. The cemetery loomed into view, its towering gates locked for the night. Marcus pulled over, waiting for the woman to ask him to stop, but she said nothing. Instead, she leaned forward, her breath cold against his neck as she whispered, "You can let me out here." Marcus glanced back and his heart seized in his chest. The woman's face had changed. Her skin was pale, too pale, like decaying flesh. Her once soft, ethereal features had sunken in, eyes now dark pits. The smell of earth, damp and moldy, filled the cab. Panicking, Marcus slammed on the brakes, but when he turned around again, the back seat was empty. She was gone. The next day, Marcus learned that a woman in a white dress had died near that very intersection a year ago. She had been on her way to Metairie Cemetery for her own funeral. Story 2. The Forest Visitor. Samantha and her friends had planned a weekend camping trip to celebrate her birthday. They chose a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains, far from civilization, surrounded by endless forest. The isolation excited them. It was a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature in its purest form. On the first night, they gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing ghost stories. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the dense canopy of trees above them. As the fire crackled, they barely noticed the sounds of the forest until it grew silent. "What happened to the birds?" Samantha asked, looking around. Her friends shrugged, dismissing it as a normal nighttime lull, but the silence felt wrong, too thick and too still. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in, and one by one, the group drifted off to their tents. Samantha was the last one awake, poking at the dying embers of the fire when she heard it, a faint rustling from the trees. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. Maybe it was just a raccoon or a deer, but then the rustling grew louder, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. "Hello?" she called out nervously. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Slowly, Samantha stood up, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she pointed it toward the trees. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" Samantha's voice wavered. The man didn't respond, didn't move. He stood unnaturally still, watching her. Her breath quickened as she backed away toward her tent. Without warning, the figure vanished. It didn't walk away. It simply blinked out of existence, as though it had never been there. Samantha stared at the empty spot, her skin crawling. She hurried back to her tent and zipped it up, heart pounding in her ears. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the shadows were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. In the dead of night, Samantha awoke to the sound of someone, or something, moving around outside the tent. The soft crunch of footsteps circled the campsite, too slow and deliberate to be an animal. She held her breath, trying to remain as still as possible. Suddenly, a hand pressed against the side of her tent. She could see its outline, a long, bony hand with fingers far too long to be human. It slowly dragged across the fabric, creating a soft, sickening scratching sound. The footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. Samantha didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, she packed up and left, but the image of the figure standing at the edge of the clearing and the unnatural hand on her tent haunted her forever. Story 3. The apartment next door. Sarah had just moved into a new apartment, a cozy little place in the city that was perfect for a fresh start. It was on the 3rd floor of an old building with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways. The landlord had warned her that the place had character, but Sarah loved its charm. Her neighbors were quiet, keeping to themselves for the most part, except for the woman in the apartment next door. Sarah heard her frequently, pacing up and down her living room late at night. It was odd, but Sarah figured some people just had strange sleeping habits. One evening, as Sarah was settling in with a glass of wine and a movie, she heard it again. The pacing. It started at around 11 p.m., the soft shuffle of feet moving back and forth, back and forth. It was rhythmic, almost too rhythmic. Every night, without fail, the woman next door would pace for hours. Curiosity got the better of Sarah. She knocked on her neighbor's door, hoping to introduce herself and maybe find out why she paced so much. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The door was slightly ajar, so Sarah hesitated before gently pushing it open. "Hello?" she called into the dark apartment. The only response was silence. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and dusty floors. Confused, Sarah backed out and quickly shut the door. The next day, she asked the landlord about the woman next door. "Oh, that apartment's been vacant for months," he said, glancing up from his paperwork. Sarah's blood ran cold. "But I've heard someone pacing every night," she insisted. The landlord gave her a strange look. "Are you sure it's coming from that apartment? Maybe it's the upstairs neighbors?" But Sarah knew what she had heard. That night, the pacing started again, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind the wall knew she had discovered the truth. She tried to ignore it, covering her ears with her pillow, but the sound only grew more insistent. Suddenly, there was a knock on her wall, then another, and another. Slow, deliberate knocks that sent shivers down her spine. Sarah pressed herself into the corner of her bed, trembling as the knocking grew louder, more frenzied. The wall shook, and then, as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped. She never heard the pacing again, but every night she felt a presence in the apartment next door, watching her through the walls, waiting for the moment she would let her guard down.